what's the use of two strong legs if you only run away? And what use is the finest voice when you have nothing good to say? What good is strength and muscle if you only push and shove? And what's the use of two good ears when you can't hear those you love? It's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got. Yeah, it's not just what you're born with, it's what you choose to bear. And it's not how big your share is, but how much you can share. And it's not the fights you dreamed of, but those you really fought. It's not what you've been given, it's what you do with what you've got.
Hi friends, welcome back to Seeds of Revolution. Today we have a great guest, Prince Shakur. Prince Shakur is an author, a media maker, an organizer. He has his own podcast. He's done some incredible writing, and he has a new memoir out, When They Tell You to Be Good, which Camus is very, very proud to offer for sale, and which we're going to talk all about in this interview. So welcome to Seeds of Revolution, Prince Shakur.
Thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here, and I love talking about my book, among other things, but I love talking about my book, so I'm really grateful that folks have been interested.
Well, as I said, we're honored to have it at Camus. I do want to get into your book. Before we get into your book, though, could you just tell our listeners a little bit about your background, especially those who are not as familiar with your work? I know you're American. I know you're an author. What brought you to politics? What brought you to anarchism? What brought you to write the memoir that we're going to get into in a little bit?
Yeah, I grew up in the Midwest. My family immigrated to the US from Jamaica in the early 70s. So a lot of my childhood was colored with being in the US, visiting Jamaica, seeing a lot of the poverty that my family and my culture experienced there, coming back to the US, kind of navigating the complexities of like the Black American experience. I had a stepfather who was undocumented and ended up being incarcerated for that and was deported when I was in high school and college. And so a lot of my teen years were kind of, I guess, shaped by um, the trauma of the carceral system and feeling all the stigma around it, and also growing up queer in a Jamaican culture. And I think a lot of those things really led me to wanting to explore reading and writing and like finding these vehicles to escape into, which led me to studying writing in college and then really understanding more about Black radical history. That kind of came up around my senior year in 2014 when Michael Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. I think maybe about a week before I started my senior year. And so I really view like 2014 to 2016 as like a time when I started to understand myself as a radical being, started to understand myself as being in lineage to people like James Baldwin, Assata Shakur, Angela Davis, like a lot of the Black radicals that have left us a lot to chew on and work through and read through. And then another part of my life is I grew up never knowing my biological father, but knowing that he was sometimes toxic and abusive to other people in his life. And that also was this thread throughout my life of trying to navigate and understand the patriarchy and masculine violence. And I think a lot of these experiences around 2014 to 16, being radicalized, like trying to be a radical adult, going to Standing Rock, having all of these um, intense experiences with political violence, and then trying to find answers that were centered in Blackness. And I think that led me to a lot of the reading I did, and then beginning to identify as an anarchist around that time, because I viewed the politics as something that allowed me to be more expansive or more of a weapon, or gave me more of the potential to be a weapon in different ways. And then of course I started writing my book around that time, and I mean, besides it being a political memoir, a lot of it for me is about what compels young people to become radicalized towards leftism, what compels people to want to understand and navigate and be real about political violence, and how can I, as a product of the world that I've been born into, navigate this more softer or more conscious or more radical masculinity. So a lot of my book is also about my dad and the different uncles in my family. Because when I look at the way things are going now in the US and globally, and I mean, the criminalization has been evident, it's been there, but when I look at history and who is otherized and who is considered subhuman, I see so much of my family, my life, and the people around me that I love. And so a lot of my writing is kind of attempting to work through um, that kind of classification and honoring like a lot of the humanity and complexity behind it. Because I finished writing my book and it wasn't like I realized my biological dad was the most amazing person in the world, but I think it allowed me to confront things about masculinity that I wouldn't have been able to otherwise. And yeah, and now I do a podcast. I'm a co-host of The Dugout, a Black anarchist podcast. I've been working on a novel. I also do like community organizing work. Last year, I got involved a lot with like the student encampments around Palestine, and was a part of a legal defense team for the Boeing Five, which were five people who were arrested for doing a work stoppage of a Boeing facility here in Ohio. But I've dabbled into environmental movements and have done work at the border doing humanitarian aid work. And so I really just try to do work where I can and use the skills that I have and continuously try to grow or reach towards something else. But yeah,
Shout out to Asada Shakur, by the way, rest in power.
rest in power.
Do you have a history of radical politics in your family? I mean, you were talking about in your memoir, you're talking about your father, your uncles. Is this something that you broke the mold on when it comes to these radical politics, or did you find that you actually come from a radical tradition?
Um, Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I feel like I could answer it in different ways. I mean, I think explicit politics, explicit radical politics, no. But I,
Because
I mean, I,
Jamaica, I
I
mean,
do think
Jamaica in
like,
the 70s and 80s was a very radical place. There was a lot of radical politics going on in Jamaica.
yeah, I'd say explicit politics, not as far as I know. Cause I mean, I have tried to talk to my family. I have tried to dig into, I don't know, as much as I could about their childhood in Jamaica. But honestly, when my family talks about growing up in Jamaica, they were like, we were in such abject poverty. There wasn't really much you can fixate on. Like, my
There
mom
wasn't
talked
time
about
for politics.
like growing up in a one bedroom shack that didn't have any running water or electricity and them having to wash their clothes outside. And so I think a lot of the conditions in Jamaica, they were, I don't know, in a lot of ways simply trying to survive. And when my mother came to the US, she was about 14, 15, and she's kind of I think she's one of the younger siblings. And so if I just look at and think about like their lives, I'm sure there was an awareness, but in terms of how my family talks about Jamaica, talks about like the 60s, especially like Jamaica achieving independence, it's not like this explicit kind of conversation or expression. It's more the island was so intense and bad for us economically that our like your grandmother just needed to get out. But I mean, I view like politics or being radical in other ways. Like there's definitely been people in my family that have been ungovernable and have evaded the state and sold drugs and knew how to have different forms of identification. And even for me now, I look at that as tools that are useful for the movement or the revolution, however they're learned. And it's a complicated thing because, of course, these are people that were doing things that some people consider criminal or stuff with drugs. But I mean, I mentioned that because it was a part of the thread of what I was trying to work through in my book. Like, if radical history is erased and stigmatized and all of these other things, and criminality is erased and stigmatized. What are the threads kind of between these two courses of action, and what in my family lineage can I learn from, even if it wasn't explicitly political? And some of that I think is what I consider some of the ungovernability of some of the men in my family, whether or not that leaned into them like treating the women around them well or having like a conscious like gender politic or approach. But yeah, I mean, I look at my family and I view it a lot like even asking my grandmother, like, what was it like when you came to the US? Or my mother, like when she was in her 20s in the US? Like, I've asked a lot of these questions and a lot of them say, like, I was working. I was
Yeah.
working. I didn't have time to look up. And I feel like that is a sort of thread or a commonality amongst a lot of immigrants. Yeah, because researching my book, it was a big thing. Like I wanted to understand more than I was really offered in like a deep kind of interpersonal way growing up. Like, yeah, I went to museums in Jamaica and we talked about like slave rebellions and maroons, but it wasn't um to me like a committed knowledge that my family was like kind of trying to pass on. So honestly, writing the book was really transformative for me because I got to see and understand things that connected to my understanding of my blackness in the US. But a lot of it was really survival. My mom said when she went to school growing up, like she thought the kids with aluminum foil on their sandwiches were rich.
Hmm.
I don't so it's just yeah, I view it as they they did what they could and there didn't seem to be a lot of space to kind of look up and look around and to try to change their conditions outside of certain like predetermined courses of action.
That's interesting. You talking about your family's economic situation, and I mean, so many radical writers have talked about um, the condition of capitalism being such that the people who are in the dire straits and who are facing the most economic repression oftentimes are the least political, precisely because they have to be in survival mode at all times. Is there a And that I think a lot of times that drives people to organize more along, Leninist vanguardist lines. Like we need an actual elite in order to mobilize and organize people who are either unwilling or incapable of organizing themselves. You as an anarchist, is that tradition something that you noticed in your excavation of your Jamaican history? Is there a Jamaican history of anarchism? Which, if there is, apologize, I'm not familiar with it because I know there's a Jamaican history of socialist organization. But I think it's very interesting to think about anarchism in the context of a society, in the context of a family, like you're talking about, in which the economic conditions are so dire that it's hard to even lift your head to think about organizing politically because all you're doing is worrying about your next meal and keeping a roof over your head.
Yeah, I mean it's a really amazing question. I mean, as far as I see it in Jamaica, I view it as like one of the classical like post-independence struggles. Um Independence was achieved, but it's still beholden to various forms of assimilation or
In,
admiration for the
independence in quotation marks.
yeah, yeah, exactly, exactly. But like that's what I mean. Like there's still this gray area that I believe Jamaica exists in where there still is this dedication to like major aspects of British colonization and identity. There still is this struggle to delineate like politics outside of the two-party system. There still is this very basic struggle to go to fight corruption. Like so much of Jamaican politics year after year after year is about where's the money? Why isn't it going to the people? Why is this politician being charged or like why are they in the news? And so a lot of what I see and understand is that without the basic material conditions for people to survive, like so much of Jamaican culture is individualistic, consumerist. I mean, there are these cultural productions that bring community together, like music and spirituality and religion. But a lot of how I see politics moving from what I can read and know from afar, like talking to family members that are here or there, is that it's still a struggle to get people to believe in the system as it is, and then even more than that, it's a struggle to figure out how to live a politicized life where you can gain the resources and the means to provide for the people around you. And I mean, I feel like that's what made drug dealing and doing a bunch of the shit that the men in my family did so enticing, is because it was a vehicle to get to the US. If you knew someone in a gang who was dealing drugs, they could get your papers to get here, and then you start doing work for them and you send money back home, just like so many other immigrants do. And so I do view it as like there is the attempt to gain resources and to distribute them amongst communities, but is it centered in an ethic that is something as explicit as like mutual aid as I'd describe it? Not necessarily. And yeah, I think a lot of it is people don't have a lot of the basics for life. Like finding a decent job is hard. There's a lot of brain drain in Jamaica. And honestly, with a lot of like Jamaicans that I've met, like who live in the US or Jamaican Americans, I do think I see more room to kind of question um some of the political landscape in a way that's a bit different. And of course, some of that is distance, but also I view it as like for me, being born in the US and then going back and then being queer, like I it's almost like I feel like I have a what's it's like a double consciousness
Yeah.
towards like both Black American colonization and also the colonization of the Caribbean. And I think both of those compel me to kind of like look at hierarchy or a vanguard or a political elite a bit differently. And some of that is like the privileges and things that I've been afforded, like living in the US and growing up here. But I view Jamaica as very much like a still the classical post-independent struggle of like they ain't even figured out. I mean, everywhere has corruption, but I feel like corruption to a point where the government is literally like it just you can't depend on them for like basic resources if you go up against certain politicians or say or do certain things. And it's like throughout different parts of the Caribbean, like my friends that live in other parts like speak towards the same thing. And so I do think there is that shared struggle of like, what does political recognition even look like if one, the government can even provide like a lot of the basics for life or can't provide those promises, and then two, like the level of repression is so high beyond even like the lack of resources. And I don't know. And for me, it's been a journey. Like I definitely got into being radicalized through more political organizations and things that kind of had a structure and hierarchy. And that was something I kind of grew out of or learned to not like as much. So I even had my own journey of trying to navigate like what made sense politically.
What what did you learn about being queer? Well, let me preface that first. Let me rephrase that. When you did your research, when you're writing your book, when you're excavating your family and your family history, how did that affect your conception of queerness, whether it be your own queerness or the place of queerness within your family history? Because I would imagine, just judging from what you've said about the men in your family so far and their tendency to be ungovernable, I would imagine that you came to some pretty interesting conclusions about sexuality in the context of your family.
Yeah. I think my queerness has been until recently in like to me in major opposition to my family. Meaning like I grew up with a lot of homophobia. I grew up with a lot of the rules around gender or masculinity that you're given. Like, don't walk. What did my mom always say growing up? She was like, don't, what did she always say that confused me? She always said, don't walk behind a woman, always walk beside her or in front of her. And I don't know, even just like messages or things like that, where I would hear that as little as like 7 or 8. And I'm sure so many other people have. But I think what I learned about my queerness, especially writing back towards being younger and trying to navigate a lot of the contradictions that I grew up with, and also a lot of the trauma is, I realized that I was always this queer person, kid, and I take sexuality out of that before puberty, just in terms of like how I wanted to express myself or the things that I was interested in. And when I go back and back, I see all of the messages against that I was given as early as 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and a lot of the men in my family reinforced those messages in ways that were even more shaming than some of the women in my family, if not as equally. And I've struggled with it in a lot of ways because in writing my book, a lot of it was I'm writing towards my father, this man that I've never known, that I'm so curious about. And there was always the underlying feeling like if he was alive, he probably wouldn't want to have anything to do with me. He'd probably have even more vitriol for my queerness than my mother or my stepdad did when I first came out. And so for me, a lot of it is the complicatedness of living in the aftermath of a culture and a patriarchal reality where for so much of my life I've measured my participation because it was a form of protection. Um and I think in writing my book, I learned that different than the men in my family or a lot of the men in my family, I think my queerness has both made family difficult, but it's taught me the immense value of community in a way that's different than, I don't know, I guess how community might matter to my family that immigrated here, or how community might matter to, I don't know, like a Black American who isn't necessarily queer, LGBTQIA. And so I think it taught me a lot of delineation between the culture you're given and the culture you find, and what deserves to exist, and how do you fight for your right to existence. And I feel like the reason I've been so political in my life is that for so many years I felt so silenced, and I also did the policing of myself when I was in certain cultural or familial spaces because like a lot of the lessons I learned was like you don't get everything you want, and if you act this way, maybe you won't lose everything as well. Especially related to like my family and culture. So I don't know. It gave me a lot of heavy questions, and even now I'm doing more writing where I'm almost questioning the ways that I survived and how some of it helped me and some of it hurt me, and how I'm trying to untangle some of those things. Cause it's maybe similar to like, I can like almost view it as a microcosm, like different people in my family grew up with trauma and they reacted to that trauma by either helping people or hurting people or doing something in between. And in my own life, I've had to navigate, like I'm trying to help other people, but what limiting beliefs do I have that have allowed me to hurt myself or to silence myself or to put myself into a certain box? And so a lot of it is owning it in a way that has been in connection to my culture, I think was like the big lesson of the book. And it's something I'm working towards right now with another project called Queer Ribian. Like me and my friend who's Guyanese American, like we've been doing a lot of research and trying to develop media around like giving voice to the queer Caribbean experience. But a lot of it was me trying to work through my own suffering and trying to give it voice, and then also strangely humanizing these people and figures in my family and life that I felt like had dehumanized me. Um, which I don't know, it's complicated, but, yeah, I feel like that's where I'm at with it.
How much of your memoir is trying to locate your biological father? And I don't mean locate him physically. I understand he's passed away, but how much of it is trying to locate, you know, who he was, what he was about, and why he made the decisions that he made?
Um, it's where the book started, um, and yeah, it's so much of it is about that. especially the third act where I delve more into my uncles and my family and my uncle Cedric. A lot of it was trying to locate him, and then I think partway through writing it, I learned this like major family secret about my uncle Cedric and how that related to like my mother's brothers and different things that have happened over the years. And so I think it started with trying to locate him, and then that question was complicated, and then the question almost became, why are you trying to locate him? Why is this so important? What will it actually give you? And can it really even give you what you need? And I think partway through, I realized a part of what makes the patriarchy so scary to me is that you just become this violent memory
Hmm.
to the people around you, or you either become what you were at your best or what you were at your worst, and there's no in between. And especially in writing the last chapter in the way that I did, instead of I think instead of trying to find him with total clarity, I wanted to find him with honesty instead. And the honesty being, what are the truths of what I know of him? Is my pursuit of trying to know him, am I trying to give myself a different image of him, one that is more soft and conscious and is maybe a father that would have been great for me to have? Or is it some murky truth in between, which is maybe you do find him and it's not good enough, and you've lost other things anyway. And the point is that one, you deserve to be in the pursuit of something, and you deserve to find an answer, but the answer usually isn't what you expect or desired or really needed. But and I guess I'm thinking of this all in terms of like the hero's journey, and you go out and you go in pursuit of something, but it ends up not being what you really needed. But it's all throughout the book, like the mentions of duppies and ghosts, my references to silence, also kind of in the longing that I kind of try to express about going out into the world and all these different drastic, wild places, and kind of wishing that someone was there with you, wishing that you could take people there with you. And some of that longing was like, as long as I live, this person will be gone. And so is there ever the chance to actually know them? And I think in the end, this book was me asserting how I knew him instead of trying to find the answer, because in some ways the answers has been there all along. It's the fact that I think about him, or I even have a relationship with him at all, as opposed to, I don't know, like my mother, she lost her father at an early age, and she's just like, I didn't really care. And so it's navigating all of the answers I wanted when I was younger, and the answers that make sense now because of all of the things that I've experiences and how I've lived, and some of my illusions being scrubbed away. But the book started with me. I kind of started it wanting it to be me solving his murder, and that proved to be hard.
You said something real well. First, I can't let that go without asking a follow-up question. Um, what did you learn about the conditions of his murder? Did you learn anything?
I learned that he was going on a drug deal to Florida, that he called um my uncle, or like a family friend who's basically an uncle, and wished him a happy birthday, and said that he was going on a trip, and he went with a dude that he knew in prison, and some way through the road trip he was like beaten up and thrown out of the car and left for dead on the side of the road.
This was in
Other
Jamaica.
people said that
I'm sorry, Prince. This was in Jamaica.
this was in the US. This was in
The
the
U.S.
US.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. Like, my father was incarcerated for a number of years, then was deported, and then returned back to the US, around the time that I was born. And yeah, and essentially, like, some people say that he was setting these people up to be robbed. Other people say that he was being set up for a variety of things. Yeah, and essentially, like, when he was incarcerated, there was only one person that visited him in like the 4 years that he was incarcerated, and it was my mother. And so the FBI was able to figure out like the real identity behind his fingerprints. And then they were able to contact my mother's side of the family. But beyond that, I mean, yeah, that's kind of the most of what I know. I kind of know the area that it happened in and kind of some of the things that were in the aftermath of it. But and yeah, and that's kind of the closest I've ever gotten because I think in my family, especially when you ask too many questions, it really becomes, oh, why do you want to know this? Or are you putting yourself in danger? Because yeah, I mean, his passing definitely led to all sorts of other people in different parts of my family, like being put in danger and fearing for their lives. But yeah,
Was your family, given that reaction to asking too many questions, was your family upset when you published your memoir?
I didn't let my family know about my memoir. I mean, no one really knew, I think, until a year after it was out, like, because of like how coming up and coming out was and how traumatic it was. I still talk to a lot of my family now, but in those years, I definitely kept a huge distance from them on social media. And that was kind of where I would share and promote and talk about my life. And I don't know. I mean, I think a lot of artists relate to this, but it's like you do all these amazing, cool things as an artist, and your family's not really that interested because they're not really into art or they're not readers, which I can understand. But I both used their lack of interest and me distancing myself on social media because in a lot of ways I viewed my writing the book as if I'm writing this because I had to survive this, there's only so much I can go to my family about if this is about me trying to work through these things. And there is the materiality of the facts and pieces of information that I definitely did some digging and learned and kind of talked to people and just kind of like tried to do my studying and learning as much as I could. But my family didn't find out about my book until a year after it was out. And I mean, shit definitely hit the fan and my mother freaked out, but, it was kind of classically her where she freaked out for, like, a day and then has never mentioned it since, which I think is her way of protecting herself.
I mean, we all experience cognitive dissonance in our own way, right?
Yeah.
You said something a couple minutes ago that I found really interesting. You were talking about patriarchy and how patriarchy turns us into a violent memory. And I just find that fascinating. I'm just hoping you could elaborate on that. What do you mean by that?
I mean, growing up, uh, I would always ask my mom questions about my dad, and she would always joke that he was a rolling stone, and I never understood until later. Um Sometimes when my mother would fly off at the handle and I don't know, sometimes she'd slap us or I don't know, push us around. Um, if I ever reacted, it usually was, "You're gonna beat women just like your dad did,
Hmm.
and you're gonna end up in jail just like he did, and your life is gonna be fucked up." So I saw the rage and I saw the trauma literally come out of her and be directed at me. And for me, that was traumatizing. For me, that was difficult because not only is this person difficult to talk about in like a joyous way, um, like extensively, but when the trauma comes forward, there's such a presence to it. It's in the room with you. You are an embodiment of this thing, which also in retrospect felt extremely unfair because I don't believe anyone is I don't believe anyone is harmless, but I'm like, I'm a queer kid coming into being an adult, and there's so many things about the patriarchy that she tried to force onto me, and so it was always confusing because I'm like, "This person traumatized you, but now you're trying to traumatize me through these gender lessons that you believe are necessary." Um, and so a lot of it was confusing because 'cause I'd go to Jamaica growing up, and people would recognize me as his son and talk about how great he was and how he sent them money, and it was nice to hear, but I always wanted to understand more of, like, why don't people talk about the harm he did? Why don't people talk about, like, the way he hurt people? And that's not all of who someone is, but it it bothered me that that space was never opened up or created or materialized, and so it made it hard for me to believe in the good. as much as I could believe in the bad, because the bad was something to be held accountable to
Mm.
in some way, even if it wasn't the bad that I had done. Um, and yeah, and I feel like there's so many men in my family where I'm like, you dealt drugs, you weren't around to raise most of your kids, you were in and out of being deported. What does that leave behind? Like, what memories do people have of you? What are you accountable to? And I think for me, like, if I could bring it down to a theory, I think the more invested someone is in the patriarchy, the harder it is to remember the fullness of them, or the harder it can be for people that want to remember the fullness of them to be able to do that. And I think some of that is just like being in a family that isn't entirely sentimental about everything. And that was always difficult for me. But yeah, for me, it always felt like I had to choose. Like, do I believe in the fucked up abusive dad that I didn't have, or do I believe in the man that sent people candy and dressed really nice and knew how to do backflips? And it's kind of like, can we talk about what the middle ground is? Which in a lot of ways is probably what I was writing towards in my book, because there were chapters about my uncle Cedric, who is my father's brother, who is a hired killer in Jamaica and was most wanted for like 3 or 4 years. The chapters about them, I kept having to rewrite because I didn't want to romanticize them, but I didn't want to dehumanize them. But I was like, what does the in between even look like? And how do I try to paint the full picture based off of what I know?
That's interesting. That reminds me of, I forget who said it. I forget if it was a film critic, but they were talking about war films, and they made the observation that there's no such thing as an anti-war film, because any
Yeah.
film about war inherently will glorify war. And I wonder if, extending the metaphor, if there's no way to write about the patriarchy in a way that doesn't somehow, at the end of the day, either excuse it or paper over it or simplify it to the point where it's just a question of black and white, good versus evil, and it eliminates the gray that you're talking about in your efforts to find the location of your father and your uncles within your story and the story of patriarchy as a whole.
Yeah, yeah, because I view it as like and there's been some writers like Casey Layman is a writer who is black Southern and is really good at writing about his own mistakes and errors of judgment throughout him coming up as a writer and dating and using women and having body dysmorphia and eating disorders and other things. And so I do think there are examples of it, but the it's interesting because I'm like the examples that I think of that are more conscious that write towards the patriarchy. It's like you as the narrator, as the guy. It's almost like it treads into you have to be accountable to the fact that sometimes you're the anti-hero. Like maybe it isn't a positive character arc. Maybe it's a flat one. Maybe it's a negative one. Maybe it's something in between. And if I look at my book, like I do consider myself the hero or the narrator, and in some ways, I mean, we could view my father's memory as kind of an antagonistic force that I have to contend with, and by the end, when I do, it's when I can kind of move on and figure out what could possibly be next for me.
Oh, then
If
it
this is
and it is a hero's journey.
yeah, 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 exactly, yeah, yeah, and so I find it fascinating, and I mean, throughout reading a lot of Black radical literature, like, I have kind of synthesized this thought about, like, gendered radical literature where, like, so many of the Black feminists that I read are way more emotive, or they talk about the errors and judgment that they had along the way, or they might be more accountable to their community, or they might have kids and the men aren't around, or they have to deal with misogynoir, and the tropes and threads I see throughout, like, Black radical literature and even, like, Jamaican cinema as I've seen it, is that there's a lot of men mythologize themselves. They overemphasize how strong or how resilient they were. They are very clear about, like, the precision of the decisions that they made and the strategy behind it, and the aftermath of whatever they leave behind is seldom there. Like, if I think about how Huey P. Newton wrote Revolutionary Suicide, or I mean, and I mean, Soul on Ice by Eldridge Cleaver, like he's very clear about a lot of things, and so even that text I find to be interesting as like a crude and brutal expression of what masculinity is capable of. And so I do think there is a lot of work to be done, and it's kind of what I'm hoping to continue to write towards. Like, what I hate the word meninism, but I think of feminism, radical feminism, but I'm like, what does a radical approach to masculinity look like? A queering of it across all of these boundaries and intersectionalities. And when can it be a hero's journey? Because if I look at my book, I write towards that, and by the end, I really hope I achieve it. But I don't view that like that book to me feels like the beginning of my hero's journey almost, because I had to contend with the past and all this other bullshit. Yeah.
That's interesting, and it actually it leads me into asking you about some more of your writing. I was reading a piece that you wrote, "The Deadly Side of Activism," and you write in that piece a quote that I just thought was really beautiful and really penetrating, and I just wanted to read it and ask you to reflect on it. You write, quote, "This feeling of being in the eye of the storm and having to do whatever it takes for the cause exists both at the beginning and the breaking point of every radical organizer's journey. Life becomes measured by the ability to stare down what others turn away from." I thought that was just so beautiful. Life becomes measured by the ability to stare down what others turn away from. I was hoping you could elaborate on that and also maybe contextualize that within our discussion of patriarchy in particular and your personal experience with trying to stare down these forces, whether they be forces of patriarchy, whether they be forces of capitalism, whether they be forces of fascism, that others just consistently need to and have to turn away from.
Yeah. I think I wrote that quote because there's another quote out there that I think it's like, the more you know, the less you sleep at night. And then I think there's another quote that goes like, I'm an organizer or I'm a revolutionary because I can't unsee the things that I've seen. And so I guess I'm interested in all these different parallels about bearing witness, turning away from bearing witness, acknowledgement, lack of acknowledgement. And some of that is like hyper personal, like to the what I was saying about my father earlier, like realizing that maybe there are parts of him that I'll never know because people will choose to forget, or it just becomes something that floats off into the ether. Um, and and I feel like with organizing especially, there have been moments where I have experienced or seen things that I can unsee. And a part of my personal and collective responsibility that I try to hold on to is that those things were traumatizing. Those things changed me. I did need time to process them, but I think they helped make me more human than I was before. More aware of the violence around me, more aware of my body. And I don't mean this in like a way to romanticize trauma or PTSD, but I do think there is a part of getting into anti-fascism and organizing where you do have to become hyper aware of the body, of like, okay, I'm at an action or a rally or a march, and I suddenly feel this tightness in my chest. And it makes you more aware of your environment. It taps into a situational awareness. And so a part of that quote is about acknowledging how our experiences can solidify and materialize a new value or sense of self or a new commitment. Like if you are someone that had plenty of friends who were sexually assaulted when you were in college and then it happened to you, like that theoretically can be an experience that you can't unsee, and it compels you to act differently moving forward. And so and maybe it's the writer in me, but I try to be very clear and understanding of the points in my life where a choice has to be made, a commitment has to be made. And I mean, I think a lot of that came up for me around the time of being in Standing Rock and protesting the Dakota Access Pipeline, and there being times where water protectors are called to the front lines and you see the LRADs coming up and the cops with their snipers and rubber bullets, like aiming down at you in the crowd, and you're with your people, and you're like, are we going to bear witness to this? Are we going to be in this space? Or is this like too much? And I guess what I'm kind of speaking to there is like it's a careful line. And I don't really know if I have it figured out. Like I do think all of the things that we're facing are both too much and exactly
Hmm.
what we need to face. And it's exactly in the lineage of what our ancestors and other people have faced in the past. And some of it is also historical. Like I believe if we look at history radically and clearly and consciously, like there are horrific acts that are completely against all different forms of humanity. And what does the American project, the American nightmare ask us to do? It constantly asks us to forget. And so for me, the seeing and refusing to forget is a commitment to like the marginalized, the vulnerable. And the way I see it operating right now, especially like with Trumpism and rising fascism, is liberalism is asking a lot of people to forget a lot of different things, to be complicit in a lot of things, to circumvent the contradictions. And I think a commitment to seeing things clearly, to naming the contradictions. And I believe there are contradictions everywhere, but I think if we don't bear witness properly, if we don't use our critical thinking skills and community and interpersonalism to navigate this stuff, we're going to forget it. And then the world, politics, imperialism happens to you. Um and I don't know, and it's like for me it's very meaningful because I look at Jamaica and what Jamaicans have been through. I look at the Black American experience and what Black people have been through. I look at queer communities, immigrant communities, just like these different communities. And so much of what is being demanded now and has been demanded in the past is amnesia, is erasure. Um, and so in that way, what if I'm bringing it back to like trauma and how being aware of the body can be extremely useful and it can make you dangerous. And it's also a prickly line. Like I think we have to hold on to some bits of what has changed us because that is how we decide clearly who we are, who we're going to be moving forward as things get worse. It's not just like me working off of like a past version of myself. Like I'm trying to be locked into all these different eras and versions of me that have seen things that I don't know if I ever dare forget it. I don't think I'd be the person that I am now.
Wonder if Trumpism and the new fascism in America has taken that idea of historical amnesia to a new level, because it strikes me that what Trumpism is saying is not forget what has happened in the past. They're certainly saying that sometimes, but what they're saying more pressingly is forget what's happening in front of your own eyes.
Mm,
What you are experiencing is not what you are experiencing. What you are seeing is not what you are experiencing. I do think I agree with you completely that the American project has been historically amnesiac. It seems to me, though, that in its current manifestation, it's not so much an amnesiac project as a rewriting of your current senses project and a convincing us that we cannot believe what is happening not yesterday, but today. And it makes me wonder if that's just another example of, that classic definition, or one of the classic characteristics of fascism is colonialism being imported into the metropole. If Trumpism's insistence on not believing what you are currently experiencing today is an importation of that American imperialism, whether it was, 1954 in Guatemala, whether it was Mossadegh in Iran, not believing that the American project is currently overthrowing your regime and installing a dictator. You can't believe that. What you have to believe is that Americans are here for good and Americans are here for peace. It is importing that to the metropole, that
yeah.
same sort of fascist project.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I like that analysis, and I definitely agree in a lot of ways. I mean, I think I agree, and then it also is tied to, like, I don't know, I mean, I feel like we're just kinda constantly in a loop, and then it's like stuff that we dealt with 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 years ago, like, it's coming back, and maybe a part of that is it's not necessarily a loop, it's these previous institutional forms of violence and imperialism and colonization reforming themselves through different eras and generations, whether it be, like, the state's capacity to surveil or how immigrants are treated or the US relationship with Mexico or all of these other things. Like, I do think we revisit various tropes of imperialism, and so there is that, but I do agree in a sense, like, there is this very real overwhelm that I think a lot of people feel with Trump 2.0, like, there's executive orders being passed all the time, and he's speaking in all these different things, and even with my mom, I talk to her and I'm like, "Hey, are you watching the news?" Or like, "Shouldn't we talk about what if ICE does come to Cleveland?" And most of my family is just like, "Yeah, I can't really like, I can't watch the news, it's just too much for me." And so in that sense, I do think there is, like, the survival mechanism that so many people are trying to reach towards, which is, like, if I don't pay attention to it, then it becomes easier to withstand or to survive.
It's the ostrich
Um
defense.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah, and that to me is and I also feel it in some ways too, and I mean, of course, it's, like, kinda complicated, like, making media and doing a podcast and offering things online that are political perspectives, but it's, like, even in the small moments for myself, like, I recently went on, like, a week-long road trip that was, like, amazing, and granted, it was great, but then I kept thinking, like, "Wait, I'm not watching the news, like, what am I gonna be returning to?" And so I do think there's a lot of different, considerations around that, and yeah, it's just fascinating to me because it's yeah, to your point, it's like we're watching the history we're seeing be rewritten as it's happening. Like, Charlie Kirk didn't wasn't killed because he was a bigot and horrible and said that, like, if his daughter was sexually assaulted, he'd force her to have the baby. He was killed because there's too much censorship. And it's also interesting because it's like it's not even it's a denial of what's right in front of us, but it's also like a continuation of their tropes. Like, they've been talking about how wokeness is censoring them. And so it's interesting. It's fascinating. The more that I read and think about fascism, it's both like fascism is demanding that we have this, like, historical and contemporary amnesia, but it's also contradicting itself.
Yeah.
And so the less people actually engage with it, the less people are aware of those contradictions because I'm constantly confused because I'm like, "I thought the left was censoring the right. Now the right is censoring the left?
Well,
So who was right 10 years ago?"
and it's fascinating. I'm glad you brought up Charlie Kirk. Of course, we were going to get to Charlie Kirk, but you know, that project, the project of rewriting history, but also rewriting current events, has proven so successful that it has infected people outside of Trump's orbit. I don't know if you had a chance to listen to the Ezra Klein, Ta-Nehisi Coates debacle.
Little
But you even get somebody like who, he's not a radical by any means, but I do take him at face value when he says he's a liberal. And you even get a liberal like Ezra Klein saying he did politics correctly.
Yeah.
And then Ta-Nehisi Coates comes in, one of the most brilliant writers of our generation, and doesn't need to use his brilliant intellect. He just says, "No, Ezra, here's a Google search." It didn't require me to do years of research and careful
Yeah.
political analysis. Here's a Google search that says that is not how you do politics correctly. So the fascist project has become so successful that even people like Ezra Klein, ostensibly opposed to it, are now not only infected by it, but actively using its tools of information processing to come to terms with current events, come to terms with fascism as it's manifesting itself in the
Yeah.
world. And I thought that was just mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. I watched that, and it's just I don't know, watching the conversation, I was like, "I think I've had this conversation 80 million times in my
Yeah.
life," because it's someone saying, like, I don't know, it's like Ezra Klein. I mean, it's exactly what we're talking about. Ezra Klein was essentially saying, forget history, fuck history. We need to compromise right now. Like it's about their feelings.
Our
That's literally
feelings
what
today, not yesterday, today.
yeah. And I find that to be so interesting because when people follow that line of logic, it's like you defang all of the radical histories that we have, you defang all of the movements that have pushed back against authoritarianism and imperialism. And what was interesting in the Ezra Klein thing, like in Ta-Nehisi Coates' discussion, is like I felt in the way he was reading everything that was happening, it was almost like an acceptance of fascism
Yeah.
in order to engage with it and maybe befriend it and then get it to change, when any marginalized person's experience will teach you that doesn't fucking work. Like it's a part of their playbook.
Any
Um,
marginalized person's experience and any even vague familiarity with history.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I found that discussion was I I think I just find myself so shocked post election and like trying to talk about fascism so much and still now, of course, but I think what genuinely confuses me is like, do liberals believe that we're experiencing this current iteration of fascism? Or like, do they even have a litmus test for it? Or is it just like we need to be nice to people so they'll be nicer to us?
One thing that Ezra Klein, I mean, he's had Ta-Nehisi Coates on his podcast so often, and yet he still doesn't seem to hear Ta-Nehisi when Ta-Nehisi says, I have no interest in talking to people who contest my right to exist, like Charlie Kirk. And the implication of that is people who contest my right to exist because I'm black, because I'm queer, because I'm Jewish, because I am whatever I am, that is not politics. That is not something we should engage in politically. That is something that we need to engage in on a different level. And even somebody like Ezra Klein, who's spoken to Ta-Nehisi Coates, I don't know, half a dozen, a dozen times, cannot hear that, either won't hear it or can't hear it. And I'm curious as to your perspective, why it seems so difficult, whether it's white America, whether it's white Canada, whether it's cis straight America, why it's so difficult to hear a black man, a black woman, an immigrant say, I am not interested in contesting my right to exist. And that is not a political question.
I think it's because people fear what the next step after understanding Ta-Nehisi's assertion is, which is if your slave master's trying to enslave you and wants to beat you and torture you, the only way to escape is through death
Yeah.
or killing your slave master. And you can kind of hear it in the conversation, like, and I think it's always where I notice.
And the liberals don't like that. They
Yeah,
they don't
and
like
it's
that.
always where I notice the particularities of liberalism, because Ezra Klein in the conversation, like, it really pissed me off when he was like, "We're approaching the collapse of democracy," and he's basically saying like, "We're approaching the collapse of civil society," and I'm just thinking like, civil society for who? Collapse
Right.
for who? Because there are plenty of people that yes, they want governance, yes, they want social services, yes, they want all these things that I think any political system can offer, but there are still also plenty of people that are completely fine and would want to aid in the collapse of the American project as we know it. And I think that's where the distinction is. And especially in what Ezra Klein was saying, because he was always trying to argue things back towards the center or a two-party system or the potentiality of like a third party or what would need to be done by the Democrats or a third party in order to be legible towards the system as we know it. And I think maybe for someone like him, it's incomprehensible that someone would want to think about, plan for, and actualize the collapse of all of this fucking horrific shit. Because on some level, it's the ground that his life is built upon. And
It's the water he's swimming in.
yeah. And it's really there because I feel like it's a part of discussions that I it's where I start to understand where people align, like whether or not people are actually able to engage with political violence in like a material way. Like meaning like could Ezra Klein name the different ways that Charlie Kirk is politically violent or enables violence against other people? Could he name the ways that the US government is politically violent or our military or the various forms of imperialism? No, but the violence falls on people that are not tolerant of fascism?
But liberalism doesn't see that as violence. And
Exactly.
I mean, and maybe this is the breakdown, because Ta-Nehisi Coates is speaking one language and Ezra Klein speaking another language. Ta-Nehisi Coates is speaking the language of violence, the language of 800 years of genocide against Black people in America, the language of 800 years of oppression of women and queer people in America. And to Ezra Klein and to liberals, that is just not violence.
It's progress.
Violence is Charlie getting shot in the throat.
Yeah.
Violence is not a history going back to 1619.
Yeah. Yeah. Violence isn't Rikers Island or people being essentially indefinitely detained after getting arrested for like stealing a backpack or I don't know, kids getting shot up in schools or I don't know, really. And I think that's what's interesting. Like people that have next to no barometer for violence are trying to tell other people what their capacity for violence should be. And I mean that's why I'm really interested in necropolitics or just like this notion that I've been building, which is like our
Did you say necropolitics?
yeah, necropolitics. Do you know
What
much
is
about
what?
that?
No, please. What is
Um,
necropolitics?
I can't remember who exactly coined it. I think Achille Membe like talked about it a lot, but it's essentially this theory that talks about how state power is derived from the state or an institution's ability to decide who lives and who dies.
Mm.
And so if we live in a world where certain people are supposed to live, certain people are supposed to govern, certain people are supposed to have like the fruits of the world that we live in, and other people are literally just subjugated to being way more closer in proximity to these systems of violence and death. So I kind of view it like similar to kind of like Afro-pessimism, but I like it because it looks at like the tools of violence and death making. And when I look at the American Project, I'm like, it's necropolitical as fuck.
Yeah, it's shocking to me how liberalism, with its obsession with fairness and balance, cannot see the violence inherent in the American project at more than a surface level. I mean, they can, on the one hand, readily admit that slavery was a violent institution, or they can readily admit that ICE agents kidnapping people off the street is a violent manifestation of political power. But there is a mental block to extending that to a conception of America as an inherently violent political project, or most nations on earth, if not all, as an inherently violent political project. So I guess, I mean, I wonder, is this where our anarchism comes in? That we, unlike people who are addicted to the liberal Kool-Aid, can understand that any form of hierarchical organization is an inherently violent project. And what we're talking about is not a different species of violence. It's just different colors of the same phenomenon, essentially.
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I mean, I think for me, leaning into anarchism and understanding it has been really powerful because if I look at my political life and how I understood politics before, it was always this organization, you join an organization or you vote, and it's the politicians deciding the conditions of like what you're doing politically, or it's the organization's kind of framework or structure or hierarchy that's doing things from a top-down way. And then I think when I got into affinity groups and being more decentralized, I don't only realize like there's a utility to like, yeah, there's utility being a part of a structure or an organization, but there's also utility to being able to critically analyze the mode of operations of how it's happening and understanding where power lies, understanding where certain decisions haven't actually been made democratically, and understanding where like the trajectory is leading towards a path of like worrying about optics solely or being complacent or doing some kind of compromise. And I mean, it's one of the reasons I really love anarchism and how its commitment to free association. So it's like, I'm not going to necessarily stop you as long as you're not like hurting and harming other people. And I trust and believe that you will not stop me. And I think in a lot of spaces that either have been beholden to a certain kind of liberalism or fear a certain militant tactic for sake of repression. Um, when I wanted to do the militant thing or the really extra thing or the thing that was way more direct action oriented, it allowed me that frame of reference to act differently. And that's both on an individual and a collective level. And I think a part of it is just this inherent understanding that like violence is a part of life and how we treat ourselves, orient ourselves, how we treat others, how we collectivize knowledge. That is the arena at which we navigate these different forms of violence because to some people or to many people, self-defense is a form of violence. To some people, forcing someone into drug treatment is a form of violence. To some people, disincentivizing certain modes of behavior can lean into a certain like form of violence or censoring someone or restricting them. And I think when we leave institutions to decide what violence is for us, we don't have any of the language or the tools as much as we could to deal with it on an interpersonal level. And then even beyond that, like to deal with it collectively. And this is, I mean, and it's complicated because even in my life recently, like I've been navigating working with friends who are dealing with substance use and like how there's harm, but you also want to hold people as community, but not infantilize them, but also not, I don't know, just give people things that might cause them to spiral out or whatever it may be. And for me, it's really helped me exercise that muscle of being able to see things for what it is through my own eyes and not through some other person or institution or thing measuring it for me before it gets to me. Because I believe that I should be the, I don't know, the ultimate decider of what kind of things are coming my way or what's being inflicted upon me or community members, as opposed to like the state being like, actually, it wasn't assault, so just go home.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to the individual to be non-hierarchical at the end of the day. I know I said we'd only be talking for an hour. We've blown way past that. But before we wrap up, I do want to ask you about living in the United States. We're both American. I fled. You did not. And in September, at the beginning of September, on the Dugout, you hosted an episode called "Is It Time to Leave America?" And since you're coming from Ohio, I'm assuming that your answer so far is no. And I'm curious, as a person who is multifaceted, and among those facets, a person who is queer, black, and an anarchist, why is it not time to leave America?
There are still a lot of communities and people that I want to be more committed and invested in saving and kind of being there for, bearing witness to like what they go through. I also think just on a personal level, like I've thought about leaving the US numerous times for a variety of different reasons, for love, for school, whatever it may be. And there's always been the underlying thought of how can I fight what the American project is as effectively elsewhere? And maybe it's like a self-limiting belief, or maybe it's just like a feeling I have or this idea, but I do worry about leaving and not being as effective at understanding the material conditions here as I could be from abroad. And then lately, I think a lot of it has been couched in either one, fearing what grief would look like if I leave, and then also wanting to make myself into more of a weapon than I already am. And the grief thing, I don't know. I'm just like, could I leave unless somebody's chasing me out? If my mom's still here, my brother's still here, and for me, like, that just feels like almost an impossible thing to even think about, but I also understand revolutionary and radical history, like, people do what needs to be done, but then the other part of it is, like, that fearing grief more than I do, like, a lot of other things is I don't know, I listened to this one interview with a Palestinian, and she said, like, the reason she hasn't, like, tried to flee in the way that she could is that she fears, like, a life of grieving her family as opposed to dying with them. And I think family can mean a lot of different things, but, there's that, and I think the angry part of me, the part when I really think about it is like, I'll leave if I need to, but not without putting up as much of a fight as I can, and I don't think I'm anywhere near where I could be in terms of being trained, in terms of understanding all of the things that people have had to do in the past to be, ungovernable, dangerous, revolutionary, and so I can just look at my life materially, and I understand that there are more ways that I can be a lot more antagonistic, a lot more dangerous, and I think I'm still invested in seeing what that looks like, even with the conditions that we're seeing now, slash what could potentially happen in the future. And I think it is a complicated question. Like, if the state is actively coming after you, do you just allow them to capture you? Do you hide? Do you flee completely? And why do we apply the moral assertions that we do to any of those things? But yeah, I mean, yeah, I don't know. Maybe I just really love the um, Claude McKay poem, "If We Must Die," and I don't know, and I feel like even on my first tattoo I ever got was, "You're afraid to live and you're afraid to die. What a way to exist." And so so in the end, maybe it's kind of like choosing the aftermath that you are most willing to live with or can live with. And yeah, I feel like in so many situations where I see someone hurt in front of me or I don't know, it's like, am I gonna roll up on the person that did the hurt, or is it gonna make me wanna leave the space? And it's all that microcosm has always been a thing for me. Like, I usually in a lot of situations, I react before I think, and so the bigger question of leaving, it's kinda like for me, I'm like, leaving to what? To do what? When, I don't know, I think there's still so much fight here, and I think if things do get worse, or when they do get worse, um I don't know, like, I do think there's another version of my life that can happen on this land and within these conditions that would look drastically different and wouldn't have some of the luxuries that I do have now, and I think that life would be, um, I don't know, intense, complicated, but I do see it having a certain level of commitment that I'm reaching for that, I think will be necessary on a historical level when we look back. And everyone has their part, but yeah, those are the considerations that go through my mind.
Speaking of a higher level of commitment, and I promise this really is my last question, but I looking at your website, and I know that you have also written about film, and I would be remiss if I did not ask you if you've seen One Battle After Another yet.
Not yet, no.
Oh, we got to do a part two. Prince. We got to do a part two where you
Did
tell us your
did you like it?
loved it.
Okay.
I loved it. But I don't want to. There are parts I loved it. There are parts that am curious about, and parts that I liked less, and I would love to talk to you about it more
Ooh, okay.
because
So
it's very much.
I don't fully know what the movie's about. Could you give me, like, the non-spoiler synopsis?
So yeah, Tiana Taylor and Leonardo DiCaprio are sort of lovers. Tiana Taylor is a radical black revolutionary named Perfidia Beverly Hills, which is just fantastic. And she and Leo are part of a revolutionary group known as the French 75. And the antagonist is Sean Penn playing this fascist military officer called Stephen Lockjaw. And Leo and Tiana Taylor have a daughter, Chase Infinity, who is just masterful in this movie. And the movie's really about Chase and Leo and this antagonist, Colonel Lockjaw. But it's just a beautiful movie, and it's got some incredible themes around Black nationalism, the Black revolutionary tradition, fascism, militarism. It's just incredible. It's a really good movie.
Okay.
I'd love to have you back to talk about it, or even just call you up one day to talk about it because it's
Yeah,
pretty
yeah.
amazing.
No, I might see it this week because I've heard about it, and then I have like a local film, like a movie theater membership, and I always should use it more. So I might check it out and hit you up because I'm curious. Yeah, I'm honestly, yeah, that makes me endlessly curious to see it now.
I would love to do another interview with you, and we could just talk about that movie, especially considering your expertise and your history with film reviews. I would absolutely love to hear
Yeah,
your perspective on that movie.
I'd be down. Yeah.
Great. Well, folks, stay tuned to part 2, where we hear Prince's review of One Battle After Another. Prince, thank you so much for being on Seeds of Revolution. Prince Shakur is an author, a media maker, an organizer. Please check out Prince's memoir, When They Tell You to Be Good, which is now on sale at Camus Books. And also check out Prince's website, which I'll link in the show notes. There's links to his podcasts. There's links to his other writing. Prince, I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us today. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Have a great day, and I look forward to part 2 when we review that movie together.
Yes, yes. I'll go see it this week.
Jesus
Absolutely.
Christ came back today like you threatened he will. Which poor group of people do you think that he would kill? And who would Jesus choose to starve if you gave him the chance? And if there was a genocide, would he take a neutral stance? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would he say it's complicated and there's sinners on both sides? Or would he say that some people, they just deserve to die? If Jesus Christ rose from the dead and on a sidewalk slept, would you extend your hand to him or just watch where you stepped? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus hate the gay folk, the queer folk, or the trans? Would he suggest they end their lives according to God's plans? Would Jesus tell a homeless man to get a fucking job, or turn his back on the poor? Would Jesus be a snob? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? Would Jesus build a border wall? Would Jesus drive a tank? Would Jesus be a landlord? Would Jesus run a bank? Would Jesus Christ feel safe in his skin if he came to your town? And would you still believe in him if you found out he was brown? Who would Jesus bomb? Tell me, who would Jesus bomb? Would it be kids in Palestine, or how about Vietnam? Would Jesus bomb the atheists, the Muslims, or the Jews? I want you to ask yourself, well, what would Jesus do? I want you to folklore.